provide a brief overview of digital soil mapping, and our goal here is just to increase our overall understanding of the topic, maybe reinforce some concepts and terms, hopefully clarify any misconceptions, and I think, most importantly is just open things up to any discussions or items that you want to talk about or have questions about. So kind of in the spirit of the Olympics, this is going to be a relay, and I'm going first. So I'm Tom DeBello. I'm a soil scientist and GIS specialist at the National Soil Survey Center, located at the Geospatial Research Unit in Morgantown, West Virginia. And Suzanne's going to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Suzanne Keenest-Brown, and I'm a soil scientist and GIS specialist for Soil Survey Region 4 in Bozeman, Montana. And I'd just like to add, just for awareness, that Tom and I are both co-leads for the Digital Soil Mapping Focus team.
Yes. Hey, Sean, I don't see my buttons to move the slides.
You want me to advance those for you? There's those arrows in the lower left corner of the pod.
That's the thing. I don't see the arrows, but if you don't mind advancing them, we'll just do that.
All right.
Okay. And again, with this, these bullet points may or may not be read by me. You can read them quicker than I can speak them. So, with the basics of digital soil mapping, we're going to step through the process from the overview to the validation. So got to take us through the entire process of a digital soil mapping project. And the overriding principle in all of this, from our standpoint, is digital soil mapping is soil mapping. Now, any of you guys that were around in the pre-orthophoto days, when we talk about soil mapping, we don't talk about stereophoto soil mapping. We don't talk about sharpshooter soil mapping or Dutch auger soil mapping. We talk about soil mapping. It's kind of up to us to take all the tools that we have at our disposal that lend themselves to improving our mission to explore, understand, map, and interpret soils on the landscape to be utilized. That umbrella term, digital, that covers a huge wide suite of tools that help us in our mission. So, digital soil mapping really is just soil mapping that happens to use an extended set of the tools that are available to us. You get the next one, Sean. So as part of that, there's a pretty long-winded definition of digital soil mapping that is pretty much considered the official definition, but that second one works just fine. We are taking environmental data, covariates, people also call them digital soil proxies or soil forming factor proxies. So we're taking this environmental data, we're taking point data, observations that we know we've seen in the field, putting it in some type of modeling system and producing a map that represents the distribution of a soil class or a soil property. Next slide, Sean. Now I'm talking about this environmental data. And again, we'll interchangeably use that word with covariate or proxy. So just think of them all the same way. But we're talking about raster data, and we're all familiar with that, or should be, but we've got raster cells, also known as pixels or grid cells, that are organized in a grid of variable XY dimensions. It's got a defined coordinate and projection system, And, that's kind of the foundation of the data that we're working with. And one way you can think of these grid cells is just a miniature square polygon. And kind of the thing that, provides us as soil scientists power that we didn't have before is the contents within that cell, the data context within that cell. It can represent nominal data, ordinal data, interval data, ratio data types. And that's important as a soil scientist because we can use those information types to help better understand, what we're doing. And once we've, got the best understanding we have of our world, we can do a better job of representing that knowledge to our users. And we can do it in ways that are just not possible in the vector world. And hopefully some of that will be illuminated as we move on in the talk. Next slide, Sean. All right. So if we just think of soil mapping the way that we're all familiar with, hopefully, and the concept of doing an initial soil survey. We're mapping soil classes within the constructs of various soil map unit designs. And our focus when we're doing that is finding the boundaries between different soil bodies. So the focus is the vector line. It's that boundary. With digital soil mapping, the focus shifts to defining the central concept of a soil body and then illustrating that deviation from the central concept through things like memberships. We're all familiar with fuzzy memberships, through interpretations or probabilities of how that soil body varies across the landscape. So, we're able to represent the distribution in really 3 dimensions, but if we're just talking soil classes, in 2 dimensions, we could represent the distribution of soil classes. And we can't do that in the vector world. And trying to represent that through a database is also not the most handy thing either. So, this is a tool that opens up a lot of possibilities to us, and we could use those to leverage our knowledge to provide a more complete representation of the soils and their pattern of occurrence. Next slide, John. Why digital soil mapping? As you read through that list, one point that may stick out at you. If not, I'll bring it up right now. And, although digital soil mapping is a good means, for the most part, it's the only good means of doing a rapid inventory, it does not preclude it from being used in projects that are conducted at traditional production rates. So once upon a time, I was a soil scientist in a soil survey office, and I just think back. If I was in a project soil survey office right now, conducting an initial soil survey, I'd be using these techniques constantly. It would be used the same way that we use stereoscopes. Every single day during the field season, we were sitting on top of a stereoscope in the morning and in the afternoon. This digital soil mapping toolbox, I would be using it that exact same way all the time. And I just figure now is probably a good time to, I'll plug the new soil survey manual. But if you go to chapter 4, they discuss soil mapping and the scientific method. And, the techniques that are discussed there, they're all in the context of old-fashioned traditional survey, soil survey. But just think of, paraphrasing some of the main points in that. When we're mapping soils, we're using the scientific method. So number one, we're developing questions. Two, we're generating hypotheses to test those questions. We're testing those hypotheses, and then we confirm or reject the hypotheses. And so as a mapper, we delineate a soil body. So as we do that, we develop a question. What kind of soils exist within that delineation? We don't really have to know anything about that area. If the only thing we know are some of the very broad basics of some of the 5 factors of soil formation, any one of us on this line should be able to make some reasonable hypotheses. If any piece of land was thrown in front of us and we knew a little bit about the climate and we knew a little bit about the terrain, we should be able to make some reasonable assumptions. So, that's something that we do. Continually make hypotheses about the soils, confirm and reject, and then just repeat steps 1 through 4 over and over and over. So by doing that, that lets us as soil scientists map efficiently. We're pretty much predicting the soil before we even poke a hole. And ideally, you get to the point where you're just poking a hole to confirm what you already know or expect. And, all of this is done under the context of, ideally, multiple working hypotheses. Now, all of that just fits right in to digital soil mapping. So digital soil mapping really doesn't allow us to deviate from that workflow. Next slide, Sean. So we're all familiar with the 5 factors of soil formation. I guess anyone from my era, you pretty much stop and start with that when it comes to explaining our world and what we do. And for the most part, most of the time at the end of that, after the T, there's a few dots. So, Yenny formalized this, and he knew at the time that his knowledge was incomplete. So he put a few dots there. Next slide, Sean. He put a few dots there to maybe cover this situation, which, I think was implied or implicit, but McBratney and some others just kind of added a few more factors to those 3 dots in the 5 factors, namely soil. So if we know the soil or obtain information about the soil at a point location, whether it's a class or an attribute, put that into the mix. Also kind of explicitly denoting the location, that end factor, the X and the Y. And then probably, I don't know about most importantly, but definitely importantly, that last thing, that estimate of error, so that we can convey to ourselves and then ultimately to our users, how much do we know about what we're trying to represent. And I think it's important to be able to, formalize that and just make that a part of our data products, because that helps us as a scientific discipline, and it helps the users also. So next slide, Sean. And the big thing that, they were trying to convey with this score pan, kind of the updated 5 factors of soil formation, is the fact that it could be quantified, or at least operated within the context of some type of quantified or statistical system. And also that it would be done within the context of knowing where these things occur, so a spatial concept. And again, the whole idea of not only being able to calculate, but being able to represent spatially these measures of error or uncertainty. Next slide, Sean. All right, so we got our factors of soil formation. We've got these raster data sets. The raster data sets are representing any one or any number of the factors of soil formation. So, you know, when a person starts going down this path, they need to consider these covariates within the scope and objective of their projects. And, you know, what are the objectives of the project? What data do you have at your disposal? What are the biophysical characteristics within your project area? And how do those influence soil development? And within the context of that covariate data that represents these biophysical characteristics, which are the critical ones that come into play for you know, any of your target soil classes or your target soil properties? Next slide, Sean. So as an example, you know, we've got all kinds of soils data. You know, we got PEDON data, we got data from KSSL lab, we've got data from the universities, we've got field measurements, there's stuff that we do within our field labs. And my computer just went to sleep, so you'll have to forgive me for a second. All right. You know, there's all kinds of data out there that represents all of these things. Next slide, Sean. And, you know, when we're doing that, we've got to think about what's the resolution of the data and what's the desired resolution of the feature or phenomenon that we want to be able to represent. You know, so if it's a soil class, what's the smallest aerial extent or patch that we want to be able to represent and kind of back calculate and make a determination? Do any of the covariates that are at your disposal, are they at a resolution fine enough to capture that feature? If so, you know, does it have to be as fine as the resolution that you've got available, or can you bump it up, make it a little bit coarser? So that's just kind of a little trial and error process that you have to go through when you're doing this, so that you can match the resolution of your data with the resolution of the desired feature that you want to be able to capture. Next one, Sean. Now, in the scheme of things, when you look at elevation data and the multitude of derivatives that can be developed from elevation data, and take spectral data, which derivatives for that can be used to represent some type of vegetative characteristic or some type of parent material or mineralogical characteristic if you're in the right place. So you combine those two things and you got a pretty powerful suite of potential tools to use as predictors. Next one, Sean. Go ahead. All right. So we got our factors of soil formation. We've got our covariates that represent the important factors. This methodology is dependent on the relationships between the covariates and a target soil feature, be it a class or a soil property that you're trying to predict. And that's true for any modeling method. So how do you go about exploring this relationship? You need to have a sample from the covariate space that represents the range of the target soil feature to train the model so that you can make predictions of areas that are similar. Really no different than what you do in old-fashioned soil mapping. It's just, it's a little bit more spelled out here instead of, I guess, being done kind of semi-consciously when you do it the old-fashioned way. So this training data, I mean, we're just simply talking about field observations or lab measurements of the soil class or property that you want to predict. They need to be reliably located, so the positional accuracy is pretty important, and those get intersected with the covariates. And next slide, Sean. So we got a bunch of observations. We've got corresponding values for all of our various covariates, so our predictors. And, you know, that prediction, the resulting prediction, is going to be most successful when those observations are precisely located and they're representative of the target soil class or properties. So that whole notion of obtaining and getting representative samples comes into play. And, you know, if you look at traditional soil survey, by and large, you know, we're doing purposive sampling. We look at the landscape and we say to ourselves, that looks like a pretty good spot. I think I'll dig a hole there. And, you know, we can use those types of samples, and we have used those types of samples for digital soil mapping when we don't have any other options. But it's not the most ideal approach when we're trying to employ, you know, these techniques. And I contend, you know, it might be reasonable to state that, you know, 100% purposive approach probably shouldn't be used in any mapping circumstance, even though that's the approach probably all of us, including myself, used for at least all the mapping I did when I started my career. But, you know, some type of random or stratified random sampling approach would be more robust, and it'd be less prone to bias. And maybe in the big scheme of things, if people adopted a strategy that kind of used a combination of random and purposive approaches, we'd have maybe a reasonable practical solution to this problem. So soil scientists wouldn't always feel like they're just a robot being sent out to wherever the computer tells them to go. They'd also be able to poke a few holes where they see fit. And I think, you know, being able to do that in combination with some type of random design would probably be a reasonable compromise to an approach. Next slide, Sean. So we've been talking about collecting observations. So when we employ digital soil mapping methods, that data's got to come from somewhere, and the somewhere is soil scientists going out into the field. So there will be, and there needs to be, field work done. I think there's one big misconception that's been foisted on our community, you know, of field soil scientists, is that digital soil mapping is going to replace field work and replace soil scientists. But I think it's probably a given. Most, if not every single one of those claims came from someone that wasn't one of us. They weren't a pedologist. They weren't a soil scientist. They were someone from some other discipline. And we could safely ignore those suggestions, I think. So, our contention is we're not going to be sitting in front of our computers making maps. Digging holes, exploring the landscape, building our knowledge about soil-landscape relationships. It's as essential now as it ever was. These tools are just something that helps us in that endeavor. And now I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne.
All right, thanks, Tom. And Sean, I have buttons that I'll be happy to push so you can sit back and relax. All right, so we're to the point now where you've selected covariates that represent your soil forming factors and you have an optimal set. You've been out in the field, you've put together available point observations, and you have a nice set of training data. Once you have those two pieces put together, then you're ready to predict soil classes or properties using a model. So you're going to take your environmental data and your training data and feed it through some sort of algorithm that's going to generate a map of soil classes or properties distributed across the landscape. When we predict soil classes, we use classification. Classification algorithms sort pixels into a finite number of classes based on data values and distribution in feature space as defined by your covariate data layers and your training data. So essentially, the algorithm is going to go through and look at each pixel location and look at the class criteria available and find which class best fits that pixel and then assign that class to that pixel. So there are two main types of classification: unsupervised classification algorithms and supervised classification. The main difference between the two is that unsupervised classification does not require your training data point set. So what these algorithms do is take your covariate data layers and identifies natural clusters in the data. Now, the challenge with this is that those clusters are non-informational. So when these algorithms run and they generate clusters from your covariate data, the clusters aren't named, water, rock outcrop, soil A, soil B. They're just class 1, class 2, class 3. So it's your job then to interpret those clusters, see what kind of meaningful information you can pull out of them. And because of that, this is really most useful in the exploratory phase of a project. It's really helpful when you have chosen your covariate data to do a cluster analysis like this and kind of see how the data is pulling out classes across the landscape. It'll give you some idea of whether or not those covariate layers are identifying the features that you're interested in. Some of the algorithms that are under this umbrella of unsupervised classification are k-means or fuzzy k-means and isodata. Now, supervised classification is different in that it needs, whoops, there we go. It needs that training data. So you're going to put both your covariate data and your training data into these algorithms. These algorithms are going to look at the relationship between your covariate data and the training data, and it's going to define classes based on that, and then go through the process of looking at each pixel location and determining which class it belongs to. So supervised classification then is beyond that exploratory phase of the project. So you've been out in the field, you've collected point observations, You've identified classes that you want to be able to predict, and these algorithms then will allow you to do that. Some examples are knowledge-based classification, which is employed by ArcSIE, fuzzy classification, predictive modeling, which encompasses things such as random forest and neural networks. This is an example of output from an ISOData unsupervised classification in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. This analysis was used in the exploratory part of the project to just see how the covariate data was clustering classes across the landscape, and was it pulling out things that looked reasonable and would be potentially of interest. The covariate data that went into this were both terrain and spectral derivatives. This is an example, again, from the Boundary Waters of a supervised classification, a predictive modeling approach. So on the left-hand side, we have the class output from a random forest classification. And then on the right is the corresponding probability layer, I believe for the moderately deep wet till and shallow wet till class. And again, both terrain and spectral derivatives fed into the random forest. When we're predicting continuous soil properties, we use a different set of methods, regression and interpolation methods. Regression, of course, we should all hopefully know a little bit about regression from, math way back in the day. But regression estimates the relationship between dependent and independent variables. Examples of some of these approaches are linear regression, logistic regression, and random forest can also be run in regression mode. Interpolation encompasses the field of geostatistics, and these methods, they interpolate surfaces and based on values at known locations, and then the assumption that things that are closer to one another are more similar than things that are further apart. So whether or not you know what kriging means, you may have heard it before, and that is the general approach with these interpolation methods. This is an example of regression output from a generalized linear model. So this is an area in southern Utah. On the left, you see the predicted layer, which is trying to identify presence or absence of a restricting layer within a meter. So you have this kind of binary output of a yes or no occurrence. And then on the right, you see the probability layer output. So one thing that's really cool that you can do with regression and predicting continuous soil properties is this idea of generating a raster stack of continuous soil properties. So this concept has been, it has been shown through the Global Soil Map and Soil Grids projects, where you can predict key soil properties at fixed depths. So if you look at the figure on the right, this could be, let's say, pH, for instance. And so we have a predicted layer for pH at each one of those 6 depth intervals. And then if we look at this dozen target soil properties, you can imagine that for each one of those target soil properties, you have this stack of 6 predicted layers at each one of those depth intervals. And then you can put all of that data together and have this really robust product of soil properties, continuous soil properties predicted at different depths. Along with those continuous soil property predictions, you generate uncertainty for each of those layers. Oops, think got a little out of order there. No problem. We'll go back in a second. So with that continuous raster stack, you end up generating this really flexible product. So you can imagine that that data stack becomes the database. So you have these estimates of continuous soil properties at different depths that then you can interact with and generate things like interpretations for management and use, much like we do with our Surgo data. If you have an interpretation that needs a slope estimate or climate information, well, you don't have to enter that into a separate database. You can just pop in that raster layer that represents slope or climate, and then let the interpretation use that data to generate the rating. And then you can also generate class data, some taxonomic class or some technical class from these continuous property stacks. So this kind of product is something that the Digital Soil Mapping Focus team is going to be working toward in the very near future. This is an example of output from interpolation methods. So in this case, ordinary kriging was used to predict soil potassium concentrations in the Salt Lake Valley. So in the figure, you can see all of the dots represent those observations. So those are our known values. And then the interpolated surface underneath that with areas of low potassium concentration in blue, then grading into areas of high concentration in the dark orange color. Okay, so once you've generated predictions of soil classes or properties, it's important to be able to say something about the quality of those predictions. So as we talked about earlier, all soil mapping methods rely on models. So we have, our conventional approach, which is a bit more qualitative and relies on a conceptual model, and then we have some of these digital soil mapping approaches which are a bit more quantitative and rely more on this quantitative model. But all of them are using some kind of model. And models approximate reality, and they all have error or uncertainty. We can't get away from that. But the quantitative nature of digital soil mapping lends itself really well to being able to report measurements of accuracy and uncertainty with our predictions. And because we're able to generate these measures so easily with these methods, it's really imperative that we communicate this information to the user. And this will be an integral part of delivering these modeled products to our users. So predicted values on a map will always deviate from reality to some extent. We don't want that to be true, and maybe, maybe someday someone will come up with a modeling method that's 100% accurate, but that's not happened yet, so we're going to have to measure accuracy of our predictions. So accuracy is the difference between the predicted value at a location and the measured value at the same location. If you have high accuracy, then that difference becomes very small. And accuracy measures quantify this prediction quality based on a validation data set. So it's important to note here that you don't want your validation data set to be the same as your training data set, because although you might come up with a 100% accurate model by doing that, you're not really conveying any information about the true accuracy of your predictions. So want to make sure that you select a training data set that builds your model and then a separate validation data set that measures the accuracy of your predictions. For soil classes, you commonly see things like users, producers, and overall accuracy, which are measured with a confusion matrix. You see other measures such as a kappa coefficient, a tau index, or Breyer scores. So those are all ways to convey and measure information about soil class accuracy. For soil properties, you see measures like mean square error, root mean square error, standard error, modified R-squared. And all of these things are covered in much more detail in the digital soil mapping training courses. Now, there's always going to be multiple sources of uncertainty in our mapping. And it's really difficult to pinpoint where the uncertainty is coming from, but the important thing is that we can generate some sort of measure of uncertainty and communicate that with our products. So for soil classes, uncertainty is communicated through memberships or probabilities. We've seen examples of both of those earlier in the presentation. You can also generate class confusion measures, which look at the confusion between classes that are predicted at one pixel location or at each pixel location. And for soil properties, prediction intervals are used to communicate uncertainty. So these uncertainty measures can be generated during the modeling process or calculated from the results. So it's not a big burden to generate these measures. And they can be represented spatially, which I think is a huge benefit for users. They can look at the map and see what class was assigned or what property was predicted at that location, and then they can look immediately and see what the uncertainty is that's associated with that prediction. So this is just an example of a confusion index which is used for soil classes. In this figure here, the darker areas are approaching 1, which is indicating a higher level of confusion between the top 2 predicted classes. And then the lighter areas have a lower confusion. So I think when you look at this map, it's kind of interesting that the areas on the left that have lower relief, there's essentially less confusion between the predictions versus the areas of higher relief on the left-hand side. And so, then you think about, well, I wonder why that is. I wonder if maybe it was easier to sample in that kind of left-hand side of the area, so they got better training data that was more representative of their classes. The model was able to perform better there versus in the higher relief areas, which, obviously it would be more difficult to collect data. So these kinds of measures can be really informative, not only for the user, but also for us as soil scientists. This is an example of a prediction interval for soil properties. I think conceptually these are really easy for us to think about. We can relate them to our low, RV, and high measures that we enter into NRCS. So conceptually, this is the same idea where we're going to identify a range of values over which the true value should occur. And often 90% prediction interval is used, which means you have this range of values, between a low and a high, and 9 times out of 10, the actual value will fall in that range. So you can see here kind of that low, RV, and high representation at the bottom, along with an interval width. So you can think of that if the interval width is wider, then the range is larger. Okay, and this is just a flowchart summary of the stages of digital soil mapping. And we've gone over the information and the stages under kind of those big ovals from a very general point of view in the last 45 minutes or so. So you start with the green. That's good. That's easy to interpret. You're going to define your area and scope. So what are you after? What's the question you're asking? What are you trying to predict? Soil classes, soil properties, what is the aim? What scale do you want to see those things at? Then you move down into identifying your soil forming factors and the appropriate data to represent those factors. So selecting your set of covariates. And we didn't talk about data sources and pre-processing today, but we talked a little bit about data exploration and landform analysis and choosing that optimal set of covariates that you're then going to combine with your training data into some sort of algorithm, some sort of prediction of soil classes or properties. And once you have generated those predictions, you're going to say something about their quality through the validation and uncertainty process. And then, of course, we're going to apply these products. We're going to use the maps that we generate for all the different uses that we can. So in summary, we talked about that digital soil mapping is the process of predicting soil classes or properties from field observations and environmental covariates using some kind of algorithm, some kind of model. From that, you're going to generate a spatial representation of classes or properties that will include estimates of accuracy and uncertainty. This process introduces a lot of consistency into our mapping, and the quantitative nature of it introduces reproducibility. In the end, we end up with these very flexible products that can meet a variety of user needs. And I'm going to turn it over to Tom now to bring us home with the last couple of slides.
Okay. All right. So I guess to summarize everything, digital soil mapping is simply soil mapping. The focus is still fundamental pedology, and the focus is adding to our body of knowledge on soil-landscape relationships and the soil resource as a natural body. Now, the only way we can do that is with a field component. The difference is, we want to combine that with all of the latest technological resources. Let's apply all of the tools at our disposal to help us understand soil-landscape relationships. Now, if these tools are applied adaptively throughout the process and we combine that with our soil knowledge, we think that's the key to helping us as pedologists provide the best information about soil scientists to our users. And there's been a set of classes developed probably over the past 10 to 12 years to help you all get up to speed if you feel you're lacking with some of that training. And there's an order that needs to be taken. There's a spatial analyst workshop that's online. We got a statistics, two-part statistics training. First part you can kind of think of as introduction to statistics. If you had that at some point in your college career, it's similar to that. There's an introductory class on digital soil mapping. All of these first three are offered online. You take them multiple times. There's really no restrictions in those regards. Once people have those 3 prerequisites done, they can sort of go where their interest leads them. We've got a class related to, I think Suzanne talked about, things like fuzzy membership and fuzzy classification and knowledge-based mapping systems. That's pretty much the focus of this digital soil mapping with ArcSIE class. There's a second statistics class that gets into more advanced techniques, definitely many more that have a spatial component to them that are directly related to digital soil mapping techniques. And there's also a remote sensing for soil survey applications class that has been around for quite a while. So there's a pretty complete set of classes that people can take to help fill in your background. And I think with that, I guess, Sean, why don't you be the clearinghouse for the questions?
All right, well, I'll give people a chance to compose their question. I know some people have been putting things in the chat, and you guys have been answering those. Prefer people put the questions in the Q&A pod, and then we can queue those up. But I'll ask a question about training data. And is the training data all the field observations that are made, or is it a subset of those field observations?
Say that again, Sean.
So on the training data, what makes up the training data? Is it all the field observations collected, or is it a subset of those field observations? Or none of that?
People can take, well, at the minimum, they could take 2 approaches. If it's a situation, probably the least desirable situation, but if it's a situation where there's only time and money to do, let's say, 1 field campaign. You got 1 field season to go out and collect data, and you pretty much got to get it all at once. If that's the point, let's just say, as an example, you have enough time and money to collect 200 points. And you can't go out there again after you do all your modeling work. If you're presented with a situation like that, people need to split their data set into a training and a test, or think of it a training and a validation, whatever word you like. But take those 200 samples, you split it 80-20, 75-25, whatever, some reasonable split. And the larger data set is used to train, and the other training set, or the other data set, is used to validate or test your model. And you really can't mix and match either, because you wind up with a situation like Suzanne described, where you just enter into a circular process of testing with your training data, which is never a good idea. There's certainly nothing we'd ever want to admit in public with any of our cooperators.
All right, we'll go to the questions that have been coming in to the Q&A, and the first one is, I noticed that the depths given, and this refers to a slide earlier on in the presentation, those standard depths. I noticed that the depths given coincide with proposals to the National Soil Survey Handbook procedures. Why don't they match normal taxonomic breaks? So I think you had 0 to 15, 15 to 30, or something like that.
I'll take this one, Tom, if you want.
Okay, sure.
So those depths have been outlined in the Global Soil Map standards, which is what was used to generate the draft standards for the raster products. The reason that you want standard depths is that in these cases you're trying to generate a product that covers a large area, and you want to be able to use these data layers across a large area. So you can imagine if you were trying to model pedogenic horizons that you would have mismatched data across the landscape, and you wouldn't be able to combine those rasters into a continuous surface and do anything with them. You would actually end up going through some sort of standardization process with the data in order to get a surface that you could work with at a particular depth. So that's the main utility of putting things into a standard depth. And what we're talking about doing these products with the Digital Soil Mapping Focus team, these are going to be nationwide products. So we will be modeling across the nation, each time these products are generated.
All right, next question has to do with the kriging tool. What kind of file is needed to be created to be able to run that kriging tool?
All you need for ordinary kriging is a set of points. So that example that I showed was just run in with the, I think it's the Geostatistical Analyst extension in ArcGIS. And it steps you through the process of developing that interpolation surface.
Yeah, there's several methods available within that geostatistical toolbox within ArcGIS.
Yeah, and I think there may be some where you can incorporate like an elevation layer or something like that. I don't remember what all is available in there. But for the very basic interpolation approaches, you just need a point shapefile, essentially.
All right, next question. Are field soil scientists going to be writing these models or simply utilizing models provided to them?
Well, ideally, soil scientists are going to be creating the models. And if you go through this training curriculum that Tom talked about, you will have all the tools and skills available to you to do that. I think as soil scientists, I never like to turn my mapping over to somebody else, and I don't want to do that with these approaches either. I want to be in control of what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's the ideal process, and I know some of the early efforts that NRCS got engaged in. They had soil survey team in their office that really wasn't provided a lot of information, and then they had some type of expert, so-called, but there was a master's student that was employing some kind of fancy pants modeling technique, and they were in their world, and they couldn't explain, because they didn't have a depth of background to explain what and why things were working to soil scientists. And soil scientists didn't know enough, to engage them on any kind of reasonable level. And, someone's working on a master's degree, they're stuck for 2 years. Not stuck, but they're engaged for 2 years, and then they're gone. And, a couple of those early digital soil mapping efforts that we were involved with went that way. And like Suzanne said, if there's not local involvement and at least some level of local expertise, it's going to be tough to, I guess, get a product that's as good as we would like.
All right, well, thank you to Tom and Suzanne for your time and effort to make this presentation today. We've run out of time. And I want to thank all the participants for joining in. We had well over 200 people join today's webinar. The on-demand recording of this webinar will be available on our Soil Survey Center YouTube channel within a few days. So feel free to let your colleagues know about this training opportunity. And this concludes our webinar presentation.